Okay, everybody, let's talk deconstruction, reconstruction. I have made a pinch pot, kind of a medium-sized pinch pot, I would say. And I have waited until it got cheese hard, like we talked about, all right? Cheese hard is the time at which we want to cut this thing apart. We do not want to cut it when it's fresh out of the bag or freshly made. You want to control that drying and really get it to that cheese hard stage. If you wait until leather hard, it's possible for you to make it happen, but it's going to be harder for you to cut, number one. And especially if you don't have something like an X-Acto blade, something nice and sharp. The other thing that's going to be really difficult is to put this thing back together. When we're putting it back together, we need these pieces to be around cheese hard to leather hard. If we start out with those pieces in leather hard stage, then with leather hard, as everything is being worked on, some of your pieces may end up getting dried out because smaller pieces tend to dry out quicker than the larger piece, like this object, right? So as soon as we cut it into smaller pieces, then we have a problem. I'm going to show you a couple of strategies to keep those things wet during the making process. But first of all, I'm going to talk about cutting this thing apart, right? We need to have it in at least 5 pieces. That's the requirement for the class. That doesn't mean that you can't do 10 pieces. It just all depends on what it is that you want to do. But one thing that's very important is that we leave them in the same shape and same configuration as they came off the piece, all right? And that's important, okay? The reason why that's important is because I don't want you to take these things and flatten them back out or crumple them back up and make a new object, right? That's not the idea of this. It's kind of a little bit of forced creativity. We're using what it is that we make, and so that's essentially what this is all about. I've already got an idea in mind of what I want to make. The pieces that I'm going to cut apart are all going to be identical, or at least pretty close to identical, and I might even make some marks on it just to kind of make sure that I've got everything kind of situated the way that I want it. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the top view so you can see what's going on. Okay, so I've got a few tools laid out here. Remember this from my earlier demonstration, this little scratching tool, because we are going to be scratching and slipping or scoring and slipping to keep these pieces together and make them good for the firing. I've got my needle tool. I've got a sharp knife tool. This is a little bit more important that we have a sharper knife tool. You might be able to get it through with something a little bit less, but we want to have that thin knife blade. Don't try and use the wooden knife tool that's in your toolkit. That's not really going to work out very well. It tends to kind of spread the clay out a little bit, and when it spreads that clay, it can cause cracking, and it's just not a very clean cut. You also could probably use that metal rib tool that's in your kit. Let me see, I think I have one here. This guy right here. This is the one that was a little bit kind of hidden in that video that I gave you, or that I sent you guys about your toolkit. So it's flexible, right? It's very thin, and you can use it essentially, right? You can also use something like a paring knife from your cupboard. That would work, okay? So the way I'm gonna cut this, I just kind of have an idea as to what it is that I wanna make for my object. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of start using a needle tool. And this is actually a needle tool that I made. So for any of you guys who don't have a toolkit quite yet, because we haven't made it yet, I'm going to post up my how to make tools at home from kind of house items. This end of the needle tool is made with a paper clip. This is made with a piece of a chopstick from a Thai restaurant. And then this piece right here is also made from a chopstick, just kind of a bamboo chopstick that's been, I think it's the other end of this, I can't remember. But I actually kind of sanded it a little bit to make it a little bit sharp, but not super sharp, and then slightly blunted it on the end, and you'll see how I use this in a moment. And then on the other side, I made it into like a chisel, okay, kind of like a chisel tip kind of a deal, right? So let's see if we can get it in focus here. Yeah. So you can kind of see how it has that kind of chiseled tip appearance, kind of like the end of like a marker or something like that. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to kind of design my cuts. So I want to give myself just a guideline, because I'm going to be making, the way that I'm going to cut this is I'm going to cut them all in similar pieces. And so I'm going to make like a little X here on the top, just so I can see kind of where everything's going to cut. That's going to make 4 pieces. that's not enough, right? We need 5 pieces at least. So I'm going to actually make more than that, more than the required 5, and that's okay because it just all depends on what your design is, okay? So this is kind of where I'm headed, is that I'm going to make even cuts all the way down using these as kind of markers, okay? So I'm going to come in, I'm going to get my X-Acto blade, and I'm going to cut my X-Acto blade all the way through the clay, and then I'm going to cut all the way straight down to the board until I get to the end, all right? Then I'm going to do the same thing here. Cut down into that, straight down in, and then making sure that I'm keeping that cut going straight down to the bottom, and that's just for what it is that I have designed for my object, for what I've thought of, okay? And then I can kind of use this to pull that out. The other thing that's nice about when you cut this at the right dryness level, when it's at that cheese hard stage, they stay in the right shape, even if I set them on the table, right? They stay in a good, in the same configuration, the same shape as what I cut it off as. And then the other thing about this is that it cuts it off super clean, okay? It doesn't stick. If you ever try and cut clay when it's in the wet stage, you'll have that clay start sticking to itself, right? Which makes it a little bit hard to get those objects away from one another. Sometimes when you go like this, right, it's very easy for me to pull that away. But if it was another dryness level, was in that wet stage, that would be a lot harder. It would actually, after I cut it, it would kind of stick itself back to the other piece of clay, and it would make it much harder for me to get it off, all right? So here we are, we're just going around. I'm cutting off each one of these, going straight down to the table because that's the configuration I've decided. Hopefully you've taken a look. I've put a couple of different objects on there. The first one that's in the picture is kind of like an exploded view of it almost looks like a basket or something, which is actually kind of cool. A student of mine made that a number of years ago, and I've kept it in my examples because it is such a good example of this deconstruction, reconstruction assignment. And that student, when she cut that object apart, she was actually cutting it apart this way, right? On those parts, right? And I'm showing you all straight cuts, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't make angled cut or, like all sorts of different swirly cuts and whatnot. It just all depends on what it is that you're thinking about doing with this object. I had one student a number of years ago too that she still kept it as a little bit of a pinch pot, like the bottom portion of it was still a pinch pot. But then the pieces that she cut off, she put back onto it and made it into a configuration so that it looked kind of like a dragon. A cartoon dragon, not a real, or not realistic. It didn't look like a living, breathing dragon. It wasn't realism. It kind of was a little bit more on the cartoony side of things. But that's okay, right? It ended up looking pretty cool. I've had some people do a lot of different things. The second example that I put up there for the deconstruction, reconstruction is a piece that a student made that is in the, it's basically like kind of like one of those bank sculptures that you might see, or a sculpture that you might see on a building somewhere, okay? And that's kind of you can certainly go the abstract route if that's what you're looking to do. So I'm going to kind of put this together in what I call like a dry run, just kind of seeing how everything kind of lays out, because I've got this idea of how I want it to kind of all fit together. And I'm hoping that it's going to work out nicely, and that I've got a good amount of pieces, right? Oop. I think this is going to work out quite nice. Opening it up just a little bit. All right, and one thing I want to make sure I don't do when I do my deconstruction, reconstruction, is that I don't want these pieces to, I don't want them to only have little itty bitty spots that they go together on, okay? So I think this is gonna work out, it may or may not be perfect, right? Because we can see that this little piece right here is not really lining up exactly, and maybe we might be able to do something with it to make it happen. But I kind of want to, I like this idea of the circle, so I'm going to see how close I can get with it. I may have to do a little bit of adjustment to get everything to kind of fall in the right configuration. If you have to make a little minor adjustment for things to kind of fit together, I'm okay with that. But what I'm not okay with is you taking these pieces and just flattening them out and turning them into a flat piece. I just had to curl a couple of these a little bit differently so that it went together like a circle. All right, it's like so. So it was just these two pieces over here. I kind of spread them out just a little bit, but they still have that curvature, which is what I'm really interested in, is retaining the idea of these pieces, the shape of these pieces essentially as they come off. So there's small areas that are here where these are going to be connecting, but it's got a decent amount of surface area. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come through here and I'm going to mark these. I'm going to mark them on the sides essentially using my needle tool. All right, so I can come here on one of the sides, probably the one that's closest to me, might be a little bit on the easier side of things. And I'm going to kind of mark where that scratching is going to take place. And in this case, it only takes one little mark, right? So now I can pull that off and you can see, if I hold that close enough, hopefully. Oh yeah, there we go. You can see that line that I've created. And so now I'm going to go in with my scratching tool and I'm going to make some scratches, right? Now, this part of the process is what's going to take the longest, all right? So let me get that back in there, and actually what I should have done is marked this on its back side as well, about where I want it to go, okay? Because those two objects are going to go together. Now the other thing that's important that I want you guys to think about is about keeping the moisture on these objects as we're working on them, okay? I mentioned it in the instructions as well. So a lot of times when I'm doing these deconstruction, reconstruction pieces, or when I'm making objects that have a number of pieces that kind of go together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them, I've already got them laid out in the configuration I like, so I'm going to take these and I'm going to put them onto a piece of plastic in the configuration I pretty much want them to be in, okay? I'm going to leave those two off because those are the ones I'm working on, and then I'm going to cover these up, okay? And I'm going to cover them up while I do all this other stuff, because that way they will retain that moisture, okay? All that moisture will be intact. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out my slip. Again, you could use saliva if you wanted to, but it's so easy to use those little bitty crumbs that we have left over from probably our first pinch pot. And we're going to essentially, I'm going to use that stuff to make my object, all right, go together. So here we go. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to give a scratch on the inside. Remember, multiple scratches, multiple directions, really mess up the surface. We don't want this thing to look like we just kind of put a little stripe on there, or 5 little stripes on there. And then we're going to come in here to our slip. I'm going to get that slip on here. I'm going to spread it nicely, get it where it is that you want it. All right, and the next step is going to be scratching again. I'm going to go back to the one where it's been sitting there a little bit, because some of that moisture is kind of soaked into the clay, into the piece that I'm making. And so I'm going to give a nice scratch to that one. I'm going to give a scratch again to this one. All right. A couple different directions. I'm going to line these two up. So maybe I'm going to kind of point it towards myself here so I can see where those two line up right here. And then exactly like we did for the pinch pot foot or anything else that we do, we push and we wiggle. We want some of that clay to ooze out the edges. You can see the oozing kind of happening right there. I'm going to leave that oozing intact right now. because I'm going to let that dry up a little bit, because then it's going to be easier for me once we get it into the next stage. Once it dries a little bit, it's going to be easier for me to actually clean that area up. If I try to do it right now, it's a bunch of wet slip. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead, because I'm just going to be doing the same thing over and over and over again. I'm going to go ahead and do a time lapse for you guys. So here I am near the end. I stopped it because I wanted to talk to you guys about a couple of things. You know, I'm choosing to show you guys how to do this last part because it's really important. Like, I'm putting the last piece on, I kind of have to scratch and slip everything all at the same time, right? Not just those little pieces. So this is kind of putting everything together. So you may have to do this if you're doing this to a certain object. One thing I want, hopefully, I'm hoping that you guys saw in this portion of the demonstration as well, is that early on when I was putting these first two pieces together, I actually was holding them in my hand. And then after I got to the third piece, then I started to put it on the table. And that's so that it could stay stable as I'm going through this process, all right? So you don't want it to start to like bend and move apart and kind of, put pressure on those joints that you've created. So that's important that you make a decision at some point as to, what you can touch and what you can't touch, right? And I've seen a lot of students try and scratch and slip a little small area, like, let's see, this big, right? Just this little tiny itty bitty bit here, right? If you try and connect a tiny little itty bitty bit like that to something, it's not going to be a strong connection. It's most likely going to crack and break. So we want to make sure that we have good surface area. That's a good amount of surface area there. We could go a little bit less than that for the surface area, but that's a pretty good amount of surface area. My object is going to stay together quite nicely from these connections that I make. And probably your deconstruction, reconstruction is going to be a pretty fragile piece to move around. So have a board for you to move it around on. When you bring it to school eventually to get it fired, keep it on that board as you do that. Okay, make sure you're really careful with your objects as you're bringing them in, especially when they're in that bone dry stage, because bone dry is the most fragile point in time that they'll be in. Okay, so I'm just going to go through and finish up all of this, and again I'm going to leave this in its regular configuration. And you'll notice that I'm actually holding onto one side as well. And that act of holding is keeping it in one spot so that it's not manipulating this joint over here or putting pressure on that joint over there. That's a difficult thing to try and think about. And sometimes, especially when you've got a camera involved like this, trying to think about how I can get into these little cracks and crevices and not moving the object a little bit closer to me so that I can, manipulate it a little bit better. I've got to think about what it is that I can get to work for you guys so you can see what happens in this process. I wouldn't normally, I would maneuver it around. I might even have it on a board while I'm doing this so I can spin the board around. We're going to get that slip on there, just like we've done on the other parts. And now I'm gonna come in and get my scratches done again. Notice that I'm holding the back side of this when I do this, so it's not starting to spread out and bend. Okay, that's important as well. Two directions. Just working up that surface. Want it nice and scratched and pretty goopy. Again, some of that goop is going to come off on your scoring tool if you're using that. Not quite as much if you use a needle tool, or like the needle tool you guys have in your kit. Okay, so then that's all set to go. Now I'm going to get this into place. And I'm going to push and wiggle and get some of that stuff oozing out, so I have a nice good connection, nice and solid connection. Notice as I'm doing this too, the rest of my object is not moving. I'm only moving the parts that are there, okay? And now it's kind of going to be stuck a little bit to the ground, to the bottom there. There we go. Now it's mobile, okay? I want it to be mobile, all right? My board might not be 100% big enough, but I'm going to be very careful when I lift this up. Oh yeah, it's perfect. It's like I designed it that way. I didn't actually. So now I've got my object done. And if I wait a little bit longer, I can come in and I can start to clean up these edges. I've got a little sponge that's here. It's a little natural sponge, so I can actually clean off my tool really easily without having to run it under the sink and run a bunch of water. It's not necessary to do that, okay? But I want to wait for a little bit longer until all of this kind of dries out to where it should be. I've got a couple of seams that are here. It's kind of hard to see it. Maybe I'll drop the camera down. So here I've got some spots right here. And what I can actually do is I can use this portion, this kind of rounder portion of the chopstick tool that I made, and kind of compress, kind of push down on this and really get it kind of smashing down into the clay. And this is just adding strength to my connection that's there. Now I'm pushing a little bit harder. And then I can go to that chiseled end. And with the chiseled end, I can further clean it up. And make it really a nice connection. Last thing maybe I want to do, depending if anybody has brushes at home, you can actually come with just a very, very slight amount of water on a brush, and we can kind of brush over that. We don't want to add a whole ton of water. If we add too much water, then we're going to weaken the connection. So I'm going to go around and do this to the rest of my object, but this is my Deconstruction Reconstruction. It used to be a pinch pot, doesn't look anything like a pinch pot anymore, but we can see that curvature kind of that happens on each one of these pieces that's reminiscent of the previous pinch pot, of what it used to be. Okay, so that's the idea behind Deconstruction Reconstruction. We do not have to be making a pinch pot at the end. It doesn't have to look like a pot, although it could. Think about that piece that we had earlier, or that was used as an example, and that example piece is kind of looks like a basket. Okay, so this is just one idea of what to do. What I don't want you guys to do is start doing the exact same thing that I'm doing. I want you to think about how you're going to cut your piece apart. I want you guys to think about how you're going to put your piece together. I want you to be creative. I want you to use your mind, and potentially, if you need to, kind of put some stuff down on paper before you even begin. All right? Have fun with Deconstruction Reconstruction.